On the quiet Friday night of March 20, 2009, everything was completely calm at Melbourne Airport in Australia. A cool breeze was blowing, the sky was clear without a cloud, and the runway lay silent as if asleep. Amid this calm, Emirates Flight 407 was ready for its 14-hour flight to Dubai. The plane had to cover nearly 7,000 kilometers. Inside, 257 passengers were seated, and 18 crew members were finishing up their final preparations. For this trip, Emirates had deployed a big 4-engine plane called the Airbus A340. It was This plane was made for long-haul flights. Because of the long journey, there weren't just 2 but 4 pilots on this flight. 2 pilots handled the takeoff and landing, while the other 2 took over during the flight so the main pilots could rest a bit. Emirates has a rule that the relief pilots, or the relief crew, stay in the cockpit not only during the flight but also before takeoff and landing, so there's always an extra pair of eyes during critical moments. But tonight, despite all the preparations and having 4 pilots, something was about to happen that no one had imagined it. As soon as the last bag was loaded and the cabin was ready, things started picking up speed in the cockpit. The captain and first officer were going through their essential pre-flight checks. Both pilots were very experienced, with over 8,000 hours of flight time between them. They had logged thousands of hours flying the Airbus A340 and had plenty of experience on similar planes like the A330. That's why this flight seemed pretty straightforward to them. But it was precisely because of their experience with the A330 that they were about to make a mistake tonight. One they would have caught if they'd been paying closer attention. They couldn't manage it, because there was a small difference in controls between the A330 and A340, and that difference later turned out to be really dangerous. At that time, the cockpit was a bit crowded. There were 2 pilots, 2 ground engineers, and the relief captain. 5 people in total. Due to limited space, the relief first officer had to stand outside the cockpit in the small front area, the galley, until the engineers finished their work. Inside, the captain, first officer, and engineers were chatting and going through their checks. From the outside, everything seemed calm, but it was this very crowd, a little distraction and a tiny lapse in control were about to turn this flight into one of the most dangerous takeoff accidents in history within minutes. Right here, the first officer made a small but really serious mistake. This happened when he started entering the plane's total weight, or gross weight, into the electronic flight bag, or EFB. The EFB is basically a tablet where pilots do all the important calculations before takeoff, like how much does the plane weigh? What flap angle should be set? How much thrust do the engines need? How long is the runway? What speed to maintain? So, when will the plane take off? How much power should the engine get? Everything. Think of it like the pilot's personal calculator. Once the EFB finishes the calculations, those numbers are entered into the plane's flight management computer. You can think of the FMC as the brain of the aircraft. It does exactly what the data fed into it tells it to do during takeoff and flight. The problem was that the first officer typed in the wrong weight for the plane. The actual weight was about 362 tons, but the system only had 262 tons entered. That's a whole 100 tons less, and this tiny mistake changed everything. The computer messed up all the calculations. It assumed the engines needed less power, the flaps should open less, and the takeoff speed was lower than actually required. In other words, it underestimated the amount of power, lift, and speed the plane needed to fly. Think of it like riding a bike alone. You can go with just a light touch on the accelerator, but if 2 more people suddenly hop on and you still barely press the accelerator, the bike will struggle to move and might even tip over. That's exactly what happens to a plane when the weight is calculated wrong. The plane was heavy, but the system thought it was lighter, showing less power and the wrong speed. The whole physics of the takeoff was messed up. The captain raised the EFB and started checking the numbers entered by the first officer. Everything seemed totally normal. Then, a third person sitting in the cockpit said something that distracted the captain. He got caught up listening and responding, leaving the check incomplete. If the captain had come back a few seconds later and finished the check, he would have immediately noticed that the first officer had entered the wrong weight for the plane. And because of that mistake, EFB had calculated all the necessary numbers for takeoff based on the weight, but those calculations were completely wrong. The captain, without a second thought, entered those incorrect figures into the FMC, and now the plane was relying on that faulty data. Meanwhile, 257 passengers were sitting comfortably, completely unaware that a small typo in the cockpit was slowly turning into a serious danger. Emirates Flight 407 was pushed back from the gate, 7 minutes ahead of schedule. The plane hadn't even reached the runway yet, but the wrong weight and miscalculations were already entered into the system. And that was it. The wrong data was going to affect the entire flight later on. All 4 Rolls-Royce engines started up, and the big Airbus A340 slowly began taxiing toward Melbourne's runway 16. That day, the first officer was flying while the captain carefully went through the checklist. During taxiing, the pilot set the flaps to the first setting. Normally, for a heavy plane like this, flaps are set to the second or third position to get more lift and make it easier for the plane to take off. The first setting gives less lift, which makes takeoff even harder for such a heavy aircraft. It made things challenging. After a while, the first officer pushed the thrust levers forward because the engines were underpowered, so the plane was slowly picking up speed. Anyway, the Airbus A340 is the kind of plane that feels a bit slow and heavy during takeoff. That's why the pilots didn't find the initial slow speed unusual at all. They thought everything was going smoothly. Meanwhile, the real problem was quietly lurking. The plane was racing down the runway at full throttle. The captain shouted, 100 knots. Now the plane had reached the speed where stopping the takeoff is almost impossible. Braking at this speed means risking going off the runway. In other words, the takeoff couldn't be stopped anymore unless something really serious happened ahead. The plane sped up. The nose wheels thumping got louder as it crossed the runway center lights. Within seconds, the plane hit V1 speed. That means there was no turning back now. No matter what, the takeoff couldn't be cancelled. Right after that, the plane reached rotation speed, the point where the pilot pulls the nose up and the plane started to lift off. The first officer pulled the side stick back, but the nose didn't budge. He tried again, pulling harder, but still no response. Meanwhile, the plane was speeding down the runway, tearing ahead. Only the last kilometer of the runway was left. Trying to stop the takeoff at this speed would have been a recipe for disaster. There was only one option now: get the plane airborne no matter what. Tension in the cockpit hit its peak. The captain yelled, "Pull! Pull!" The first officer gave it his all, pulling the side stick back as far as it could go. Finally, the nose started to lift. For a moment, there was a sigh of relief in the cockpit, but that relief lasted only 2 seconds because the pilots were faced with the nightmare every pilot fears. Only the nose had lifted. The rest of the plane was still stuck to the ground. The side stick was pulled back with full force. The nose was in the air, but the instruments clearly showed the altitude was almost 0. The plane was trying its best to climb, but it just wouldn't leave the ground. As the plane sped down the runway, the officer was trying with all his might to get the plane off the ground. He kept pulling the side stick back again and again, but the plane just wouldn't budge. It wasn't lifting at all. Things had gotten really dangerous, and then bam, the tail of the plane slammed into the runway. Rubbing against the ground at nearly 300 km/h meant sparks flying, loud screeches of metal scraping, and the passengers inside could even smell the sharp, bitter stench of burning metal and insulation. Within moments, the cabin was filled with red, scary emergency lights. It happened. The impact was so strong that the flight data recorder, the black box, got dislodged and smashed into the fuselage wall. The back of the plane was clearly badly damaged, but the fear didn't end there. The plane was still speeding down the runway, which was almost over. If it didn't take off now, it would plunge straight down a steep slope outside. No chance, no turning back. Seeing this, the captain suddenly pushed the throttle to max power. This was the final gamble, a do-or-die moment. The lives of 300 people it was hanging there for a few seconds. The plane sped past the end of the runway at about 300 km/h. The tail was scraping the mud, and then finally the main wheels lifted off the ground. A second later, the tail lifted too, and the heavy plane started wobbling its way up into the sky. The plane was climbing, but really weakly, like it could run out of power and drop back down any second. As it went up, things got worse. The tail hit the localizer antenna, tearing the back even more. After that, the plane hit a runway light. As it passed through, it broke too. The first officer was barely keeping the plane in the air, just scared it wouldn't crash again by falling. Then, suddenly, a sharp warning flashed on the cockpit screen. The tail strike. ATC had also seen sparks flying from the tail on the runway. They immediately informed the pilots over the radio about what had happened down there. Now the truth was out. Going to Dubai was impossible. The plane had to turn back to Melbourne at all costs. But now there was a new problem. The plane was carrying over 130 tons of fuel. Friends, in the video, before we move on, a quick thing. If you're even a little bit enjoying this video, please make sure to hit like and subscribe to a Crossair channel. Now, let's get to that moment where everything was about to change. Landing with such a heavy load was super risky because the plane's landing limit was way lower than that. The only way to land safely was to dump fuel while still in the air. ATC immediately ordered them to climb to 7,000 feet and head out over the sea so they could safely dump the fuel there. Everyone's heart was racing in the cockpit. Everyone knew the deal. If the captain hadn't hit max power at the last second, the plane would crash into the dark slope just past the runway, turning into a massive fireball. Now the pilots couldn't just act on fear or panic. Every second counted, and they had to keep a clear head, focusing on one thing: how to get this heavy plane safely to Melbourne. Before landing, the biggest question was how much fuel they'd need to dump to get the plane's weight within safe limits. For that, the EFB, there was no need for it, but as soon as the first officer opened the EFB, his hands and feet went numb. The screen was on the takeoff page, and the weight listed was 100 tons less than the actual weight. Right then, he realized how big a mistake he had made. A small distraction had put almost 300 lives at risk. There was no time to think or regret. Just then, the relief first officer sitting behind panicked and said, "The aircraft isn't pressurizing." Pressurization in a plane means that even at high altitudes with thin air, the inside air, they had to keep the pressure steady so people could breathe comfortably. But the tail was worn out and had cracks in the fuselage, which was letting air constantly escape. That's why the cabin couldn't maintain pressure. Basically, flying at high altitude was really dangerous now, and they had to turn back to Melbourne immediately. The captain grabbed the radio and said, "Pan, pan, 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 pan. This is a kind of emergency alert, meaning the plane is in trouble and needs urgent help and priority. But the situation isn't as serious as a full emergency yet. In simple terms, it means our situation wasn't good. All other planes were held back, and we were given the go-ahead. Melbourne ATC immediately gave Flight 407 top priority. That meant every other plane had to stop, and the ground teams were ready on the runway to check for any damage as soon as the plane landed. Every second counted right now. Every pilot's focus was on just one thing: getting the plane down safely. Any mistake or delay could have turned into a serious accident. In just a little while, the pilots were about to see something that would shake the entire cockpit. But before that, all 4 pilots got stuck on a decision that the whole flight depended on: how much fuel to dump before landing. It wasn't an easy call at all. On one hand, the safe landing weight limit was 243 tons, and landing above that could cause the brakes to overheat and fail. The landing gear might break, and the aircraft's tail, which had already scraped and cracked on the runway, could get even more damaged during landing. But on the other hand, there was an equally huge fear that if they dumped too much fuel, if for some reason they had to go around during landing in those final moments, there wouldn't be enough fuel left to try landing again. In other words, just one shot, one attempt, and even the slightest mistake in that one try could have turned into a catastrophic accident for the entire plane. The risk was equal on both sides, either the danger of landing with extra weight or the fear of not having enough fuel to circle back. So the pilots chose a middle path and decided to dump 80 tons of fuel, bringing the plane's weight down to about 280 tons. Yeah, it was still 37 tons over the limit, but that was enough. The pilots could save fuel and try landing 2 or 3 times if needed. There was no room for error this time. So, they carefully calculated the landing plan 3 times, twice on the electronic tablet and once in the actual performance book, to make sure there were no mistakes with weight, speed, or runway requirements. But the one question on the pilots' minds was why such a big mistake wasn't caught before takeoff. The root of all this chaos was the breaking of the sterile cockpit rule. This rule clearly states that during any critical moment, the cockpit, it was supposed to be all work, no noise, no chatting, nothing that would distract the pilot. But that day, the atmosphere at the gate was all wrong. People were coming and going, announcements were playing, and there was light chatter. Those little distractions ended up hiding a massive 100-ton mistake from everyone's notice, which later turned into a serious risk for the whole flight. On top of that, the relief pilots couldn't really help out properly. Normally, the relief captain double-checks the takeoff numbers on a separate tablet, but the cockpit was so crowded he couldn't even pull his tablet out because the ground engineers were standing inside. The relief first officer was mostly outside, waiting in the galley. With so many people around, the pre-flight check couldn't be done properly. Another big issue was that no one found the wrong figures on the EFB strange because all the pilots were used to flying lighter Airbus A330s. Their weight and speed numbers are quite similar to this plane's. So even after entering the wrong weight, the speeds and flap settings looked normal to everyone. That's the reality of aviation. Everything runs on numbers, and even a small mistake can be critical. You can't really see or catch it, but that little mistake slowly turns into a big danger. That's exactly what happened here. Now, at 7,000 feet above sea level, the aircraft's torn tail and the cabin pressure not holding properly clearly showed how a small slip-up at the gate turned into a serious crisis. The pilots didn't have a second to think. They had 257 lives on their hands, and their only job was to get everyone back on the ground safely, no matter what. Just then, a message came from control saying the runway had been fully checked, and the results were really bad. At the end of the runway, pieces of the plane's broken tail were scattered around. There were several metal fragments lying about. One of the runway lights was smashed, and a few antennas had been knocked off. It was clear that the impact during takeoff had been pretty severe and had caused serious damage to the plane. Meanwhile, the captain spoke to the passengers for the first time. In a calm voice, he explained that the plane's tail had hit the runway during takeoff, and now they were dumping fuel and heading back to the airport. But many passengers were already panicked because they had heard a loud crashing sound from below as the plane was taking off. There were sounds, and red sparks were seen rising from the window. For any ordinary person, this sight would be terrifying. The cabin crew immediately started preparing the cabin for landing. Meanwhile, the pilots began dumping fuel. About 2 tons of fuel were being released every minute from the nozzles behind the wings. The captain kept circling the plane near Melbourne so they could land quickly if anything went wrong. On the cockpit screen, there was just one warning showing that something was wrong, but no one yet knew how serious the damage really was. That's why the captain felt it was important to get more info from the cabin crew. He called the lead flight attendant into the cockpit and asked what they saw during takeoff, how the sound was, and what they thought about the condition of the tail section. At that moment, this info was the most crucial for him. For a while, it seemed like things were slowly coming under control. At 11 p.m., the fuel dump ended, and the plane started descending towards Melbourne. But as the plane came down, suddenly there was a strange rumbling noise from the back. Before the pilot could make sense of the noise, the cockpit phone rang. The flight attendant's panicked voice came through from the back. "Sir, there's smoke coming from the rear, and I can smell it too." Things had just taken a seriously dangerous turn. Every second was racing by, and the pilots had to act fast without hesitation. Reports of fire and smoke had already come in from the back, and if there really was a fire, they had less than 20 minutes left. Before things got worse, the first officer immediately informed the tower, "We're turning back right now." There was no time to pick a runway. Even though the wind favored runway 16, it would have been the right choice, but getting there would have taken too long, and at this time, any delay meant a direct threat to life. So, the pilots decided to land immediately on the runway 34 they could see ahead, without wasting any time. But the problems didn't end there. The plane was overweight, its tail had already cracked during takeoff, and on top of that, there was a strong tailwind. That meant the landing speed would be even higher. Still, they had no choice but to land. The first officer clearly told the lead flight attendant that they might have to evacuate immediately after landing. "Get ready." As soon as this was announced, the entire cabin went silent because everyone knew that in a fire situation, every second could save a life or take one. Meanwhile, the tower sent all the airport's fire and rescue units out to the runway. Ironically, this was the very same plane that had come dangerously close to disaster just an hour ago during takeoff, and now, on landing, it was facing the same threat again. The pilots lowered the gear, set the flaps, and began a tense approach to runway 34. The captain knew that the moment the plane touched down, it would be overweight. The plane had to slam on the brakes with full force. All he could think about was one fear. If there was even the slightest slip in braking, the plane could skid off the runway again. At 11:30 p.m., Flight 407 reached the lights of runway 34, the same runway where they had broken a light during takeoff. The next moment, the plane slammed down hard on the ground. The captain pressed the brakes with all his might and pushed the engines into reverse. The plane was fighting to stop, but instead of slowing down in those first few seconds, the speed actually seemed to pick up. The first officer kept saying over and over, the speed was too high, it wasn't coming down, and the tension in the cockpit had reached its most dangerous level. After some really scary moments, finally the huge plane came to a stop right at the very end of the runway. The biggest relief was that the rescue teams immediately confirmed there was no fire anywhere on the plane. All 257 passengers and 18 crew members were safe. It was nothing short of a miracle because just minutes before, things had completely gotten out of control. That night, when the pilot and cabin crew reached their hotel in Melbourne, they faced yet another shock. They were waiting for him. Emirates immediately called everyone and gave strict orders not to contact their family or anyone close. They even said their mobile phones and hotel room phones would be monitored. The company didn't want any information about the incident to get out. A few days later, when everyone returned to Dubai, the airline fired the pilots. After Flight 407, major changes were made to flight safety. The new systems now give instant warnings if there's wrong takeoff data, and many more improvements have been made. Airlines have 2 pilots double-checking calculations to catch any mistakes.